So the last thing I want to do is give you an overview of what happens when you load Py4Web, as I mentioned. What are the purpose of these files? So Py4Web loads an application as a module. The init file is the one that is loaded first. And you can see that it imports the definition of the database and the definition of the controllers. Let me go to the controllers last. The order in which I normally look at things is the following. Settings contains simply some declarations that are used in your application. For example, you will define here, and we will get into details where the database is, and it has some definitions that for the moment you can just leave unchanged. Okay. Then the models contains the definition of the database tables. At the moment it's empty because we haven't defined any database table for a Socker application. I just defined here two functions for you that will be useful in the future. One that provides the email of the logged in user and the other one that provides the current time. Okay, so common contains all the basic definitions, and it's worth at least a super quick look. All these files, you should look at them in a greater detail when you on a per need basis, I think, and we will be playing with them a lot with during the class. So here there is something about logging that enables you to log. Okay, we come to logging later. For the moment, we just can print out, use print in order to see error messages. Now, this is incredibly important. We want to be able to connect to a database. The reason I will explain to you in the next series of lectures, but we want to be able to connect to a database essentially to store and retrieve user data. And so here we create an object called DB that will contain a connection to our database. When we will talk to the database, we will use this object DB. For example, to say that we want to update some data, we can say db.update, or to insert data, we can say db.insert. Essentially, DB will be a sort of our butler for dealing with the database. It's the object that contains the declaration. Then, what are the other important definitions? There is an important definition of the session object that I also will need to talk to you later about. Okay, but we define what a session is. Don't worry, I will come to it later. And we'll define the auth object that is used for user authentication. Okay, so these are the sort of three fundamental objects that are defined here: database, session, and auth, and we will cover them in turn. Okay. So this is what is in common. Okay, so common contains essentially these generic definitions that you need very often when you develop pages, because it contains the definition of the database, of the session, and of the authentication. In controllers, here is where you really will spend most of your time writing, because here is where you define what to do when people request a particular web page. Here you see that you import, it's hidden here, but you import things from common, from models, and from other places. And this action statement without the dot uses, this says which URL request you are going to handle. This says the action uses says which elements do you need to process the request, and then you follow with a function that will cause the page itself to be served. Essentially, you are serving this template. Now you may wonder, what is the purpose of this dictionary that I return? The fact is that this is a page that uses a template and can have holes in it. So in fact, let's try to put a hole in it and fill it with interesting content. Okay, so that you can see with an example what that does. I take this page using templates, and I don't know. instead of um, let me do a very simple template. I can say h2 class is equal to subtitle, okay, year colon, okay, and I want this year to change to be computed by Python, essentially, not to be static. So I can say essentially with this square parentheses, I can say equals year. So this will fish out from the dictionary the value of the year component, okay. And if we go into the controllers, now I can say year is equal to 1984, okay. So if I now reload, oh, don't give me this message anymore, but if I now reload and look at this page, okay, not only, but this is produced by code. For example, I can say this year is equal to y. I can say import random, right? I can import any standard Python module if I want. And then I can say, for example, here that y is equal to random randint. Give me a random year between 1980 and 2020. Okay? And so this, every time I load the page, will fill that hole with a random item. Let's see. Oh, I have to reload. And this works. You see, every time I load the page, there is a random number. So this is the role of the dictionary that you return. The values that you return in the dictionary are used to fill the template. The template, by the way, is a general templating language. Let me give you a few examples of what you can do in the templating language. Inside here I can put a t-head for the head of the table and a t-body for the body of the table, okay? A t-body. Great. Now here I want to have the header of the table. That normally is done by a sequence of th cells, one for each field, right? And so I can say here in Python, I would like to say essentially for h in headers, okay, and here I would like to say print h, no, because I want to print a header. This would fill in the header in a nice way. But I cannot do this in the templating language. I need to do something that is close but not quite identical. So the instructions for the templating language are closed in these pairs of opening and closing brackets, okay, and this is a for loop. Because indentation doesn't matter in HTML, I need to close loops with a pass, okay? And instead of print h to output the content of a variable h, I simply do exactly what I do here for the year. So I do essentially open and close and say equal h, okay? So this will loop in the headers and print out a header. The body is empty so far, okay? Let's leave the body empty and let's go to the controller to fill in these, okay? For example, what are my headers? I can say that headers is a list, and I may want to put into it, for example, name, last or email, and role. Okay, and then here in this dictionary that I output, I usually like to format it nicely. I say, well, I have to continue saying giving the year, and I can say headers is equal to headers. Okay, so here I'm building essentially a dictionary that has two keys, year and headers. I'm passing it to the template, and the template will use it here and here. Okay, so let's see how this looks like. So I save everything, I restart the thing, because every time there is a code change I need to restart. Now I load these, okay, and well, my table is not very pretty, I have to say. And that's probably because I forgot to say that this table is of class is equal to table. So if I don't modify the Python code, I don't need to actually reload, so it can be a bit faster. Okay, name email role. Okay, that's a great header. There is no content, and there is no content for the reason that I'm not passing any content. So assume that I want to pass some rows to this table. How do I do it? Well, I can do it as follows. Here, what is a row? It can be a dictionary mapping, or maybe that's too complicated. I can simply have that a row is a list. Well, do I want to specify a row as a dictionary or as a list of elements to fill in? I think as a dictionary is a little bit more elegant. So let me do it slowly in code first. Row 1 is equal to a dictionary, okay, where, or maybe I can just use, no, let me use, where name is Luca. I'm not full of fantasy, I'm sorry. Email is luca@ucsc.edu, and role is like a professor. Okay, and then I have another row. Let me just have to be faster, in which again, you know, name is I don't know, like Joe, and the email is like Falchetto at snoopy.org, and you know, the role, I think it would be sort of, you know, cool guy. No? Joe Falchetto, for you, those of you who read Peanuts. Okay, so I have two rows that are dictionaries from headers to content. Okay, and then I can say here, you know, that my rows in the reply to be used to fill in the header are rows is equal to a list containing row 1 and row 2. Okay, so this does it. I always put a comma at the end so that if I need to add one more line is easy to do. So you see, I'm building essentially the data types in Python that are used to fill in the template. And if I go to the template, now I can say that the tbody, I also have to loop here, and so I say for r in rows, and I find it convenient to immediately close it with a pass so that I don't forget. And then I do, what do I have to do? I have again to loop over the headers. Right, because I have to loop over the headers in order to access the dictionary. So I have to put another loop inside this that says, let me indent it, for h in headers, and you know, and then pass. And inside here, I can put, and the closed tr cell goes here. Okay, inside here, inside here I put the output. So for each cell I need to put a td and a close td. The td is the tag that is used, for a cell in the table, and here I need to read the element of the row that corresponds to the header. So I say is equal to r, and then open and close to access the dictionary. Here I have to be a little bit careful here to leave a space, okay? And here I say equal to the row of the header. So let's see if this works. Okay. So if I rerun the code, okay, and try to load the table, it works. Now I want to show you a couple of errors that can happen. Okay, so let me show a couple of things. Suppose you forget a pass statement. Okay, what would happen? Let me save, reload, and what you get is an internal error. The internal errors you get when there is an error in the template are fairly unpleasant because they don't tell you exactly where they occur. But here you can see that the error is a runtime error, missing pass in view. So there is a some loop that you have not closed with its pass, and so it's a bit tedious because it doesn't tell you where. But after you stare at it for some time, you may figure out that it's here. This is another error you may do is you forget a colon. I think that also would generate an error. So yes, and this tells you missing pass in view. Again, it sort of complains in the same way because it does not know essentially how to parse it. Okay, so I fix it. Now this works again. If the error is in the code, it's actually somewhat counterintuitively. We would assume it's harder to find errors in code than in the templates because the templates are simpler logically. But the errors in code are actually easy to find. For example, if I divide by 0 here and I restart these and I reload the page, I also get an internal error, but the error is much easier to find. 0 division error, division by 0, and if I click here, it sends me to the place where the error occurred. Instead, if the error is in a template, let me produce another template error. If the error is in a template, let me omit this colon just to try. You see, if I go to the place where the error occurs, it's gonna be a fairly obscure place inside the template code, which you haven't written and which you're not supposed to be bothering with really. So if the error is in a template, you see it because it's the error it's in the package YATL, yet another template in language. That's a sign that you have to read your template very carefully and experiment with it. And those errors are unfortunately probably the nastiest. So this brief tour gives you an idea of how to serve pages from Py4Web. There is a lot of work that we still need to do. We need to go into the database, into the authentication, into what is a session. Essentially, we have to go into everything that is user dependent. That I will explain from next lecture onwards. But at least we know how to create a new app, cause it to serve a web page of our wishes, build the page from code by filling the template, and writing the template itself. Okay, so this is the include place that is filled in the template, and our template is actually this one. Okay. In the template you can use for loops, you can use if then else's, you can output the value of variables. So the templating language is quite rich, and you can find it in the Py4Web documentation, YATL template language. YATL stands for yet another template language, and I think you should truly read at least the basic syntax and also the YATL helpers, which give you helpers to generate more easily HTML content. And so with this I conclude sort of the serving of the static pages, and from next point on we will need to go into how to serve web pages that are created via user interaction, dynamically in response to a user and customized by who the user is.